And Ettienne Le Roux, Chief Economist at RNB, and here to talk to us about the Consumer Price Index and the Monetary Policy Committee. Ettienne, lovely to have you as always. Let's maybe start off with the market reaction, currency reaction to today's news.
I think the rand was a little bit stronger, but then a little bit weaker again. The bond market did the typical thing. If you look at the yield curve, it flattened somewhat, so the short end came up, and the long end of the bond market yields came down. So the market seemingly then liking the idea that the central bank finally has acted. They've been warning for a number of months, and today we've seen them following through.
Ettienne, we thought the 4.7 CPI instead of 5 might have pushed the raise out, perhaps another time. Yep. And then we recalled yesterday Janet Yellen saying you must be careful not to be behind. Perhaps you need to get ahead sometimes of the curve.
Yesterday's inflation, yes, a positive surprise, but interestingly the governor said that despite yesterday's inflation data, they actually revised their inflation forecast slightly up, right? So that would suggest that they probably fine-tuned their forecast on the currency, maybe a little bit higher on oil, whatever the reason is. So that didn't influence, clearly that didn't influence the governor's decision or the committee's decision today to hike yesterday's good inflation data. Whether they followed advice from the Fed governor, I'm not so sure. What is clear to me is that the MPC acted today predominantly, they acted on domestic considerations. Right. And I think the Fed was in the back of their minds, but there was good enough domestic reasons to justify their actions purely based on the inflation forecasts.
I think the big question is, was it the right decision? What do you think? Do you think this was something that was justified or something that was maybe premature, considering the fact that the Fed's going to be raising probably at the end of the year?
I think it was important. I think it was the right thing to do. I think international creditors, investors started to doubt the central bank's inflation-fighting credentials because they've been warning and warning and warning and not acting. They finally followed through. So I think they've strengthened their credibility. And once again, I think we should never underestimate, as an asset for the country, we should never underestimate the importance of an independent, credible central bank. And I think today, by acting, they strengthened that position. So for me, it was the right thing. And as I suggested earlier, I think they acted on a very concerning inflation outlook. And very importantly, their mandate primarily is price stability. Growth is important, but when they have to choose between the two, push comes to shove. If the inflation outlook is not great, despite weak growth, they will go the former, and that's exactly what they did today.
Absolutely, and maybe if we just if we turn this conversation to the perspective of the consumer, the implications of this decision and what life is going to be like trying to be a surviving consumer in the South African context.
Very importantly, 2 observations. The hike today happens against the backdrop of consumers having deleveraged for the last while, very importantly. Secondly, it also comes against the backdrop of the average household's net wealth to disposable income ratio having increased dramatically. The stock market is rallied, the property market has held up relatively well. So it seems to me from those two points, considering those 2 things, that generally speaking, households are in a not too bad position to absorb this small hike. 25 basis points is certainly not going to break the bank.
It's also relatively new, the 25 basis points. I mean, if you look at most of the years over the last 10, 15 years, it was half or nothing.
Yes, and I think here, David, important is the level. Interest rates, if your repo rate, your policy rate is very low, it makes sense to move in small increments. If it is high, at a higher level, in level terms, it makes sense to move with bigger increments. Because it's the percentage change that matters.
But also it's more gradual. Whatever effect there is easier to absorb.
And it's clear to me that we don't have to have sleepless nights, that this is going to be an aggressive tightening cycle. The central bank, I think, is very clear that they're going to take baby steps. This is going to be a slow, gradual process.
It may be a slow, gradual process, but what do you forecast in terms of the actual, the magnitude of this particular cycle? How high from here do you think is going to be the upside?
Our view, maybe another 25 basis points.
That's all.
I don't think we have to be too worried about an aggressive cycle.
Well, on that note of high will it go? We say a big thank you to Ettienne Le Roux, Chief Economist at RMB.